and look a little bit at the models that the industry might pursue to try and address the issue. Obviously, the crisis has thrown up the sort of the central utility as being a bit of a panacea. Obviously, that remains to be seen. Now, I understand that in the reference data community at the moment, there is quite a vigorous debate going on regarding creating some kind of external utility which would create some kind of standardization, and perhaps in the long term, firms, rather than using their own internal databases, would use this utility. Can we talk a little bit more about that? I mean, do you think that that's a likelihood, and what do you think the benefits or the arguments would be for that kind of model?
I think it is likely. I think it would be beneficial. I think often at the moment within the industry there is a conversation or a discussion of standards versus the utility, almost as if they're mutually exclusive. I don't see it that way. I see very much as standards and utilities reinforcing transparency within the industry. I think the utility should come first. Historical precedent, I think, tells me that. I only have to look back at the power generating industry. It's not too long ago, I think it was 1916 or something like that, that London had 23 different plug formats, 24 different voltages. The introduction of standards and the introduction of a utility provider for electricity drove the standard to the national grid as we know it today. So I think a utility can be a tool in driving those standards throughout the industry, as I think it's in the utility's interest to have those standards. It's not in the utility's interest to maintain a multiple diverse set of symbols. The utility ultimately will want to minimise the amount of symbols that it has to manage, and therefore I see the utility as a necessary tool in driving towards standardisation.
I mean, obviously we know, especially on the investment banking side, that the institutions can be quite proprietorial about the information that they use. Do you think there is an appetite amongst firms to just push this outside, let someone else deal with it, let someone else define these standards? Or do you think that they'd prefer to lead the debate? I mean, how does that sort of tension work itself out?
I think they're getting there. I think there's a concern in the industry that a leap to standards is going to be just too difficult. So I think the utility has a role to play there in helping navigate and helping organisations migrate towards a standard codification structure. If you look at where we are with some of the proprietary transaction trading systems or in some of the trades that organisations do, it's just going to be too difficult to throw a one-size-fits-all standard at them. So I think there's an element of concern in moving towards standards where people feel that they have either a proprietary system or proprietary codification that they need to move away from. I think also that if you look at the data themselves, people will always have a concern that some data is unique to them. As long as either they can maintain that or the utility has an ability to maintain private data, perhaps an organisation feels it has a competitive edge in emerging markets or has particular sources of information that it wants to maintain. I think as long as the utility can preserve that privacy around certain data, organisations can then look at what components of our data genuinely isn't competitive, what is going to help the industry in terms of straight-through processing or in terms of post-trade processing. And then we can manage that centrally, but still allow organisations not to feel that they've given the baby over with the bathwater.
Sure. I mean, in some of the debates I was reading about earlier regarding the creation of a central utility, it seemed to me that the industry would prefer something that was, bank-owned, essentially, I guess a little bit like SWIFT. And I think there was a concern, as we've seen in the credit default swap marketplace, that there would result in too many utilities and you wouldn't have a golden standard, which would sort of defeat the entire object of the exercise. I mean, can you give me your views on that, and where do you think software vendors like SmartStream and Declear fit into this picture?
I think there are many views about the utility, many definitions. For a lot of people, industry utility bank-owned means free. It means free data, and it means a move away from the traditional aggregators as sources of data. I think for me, the utility is a commercial proposition. I think we have a role to play in that someone has to manage that data, someone has to validate that data, create a consistency across that data. Someone has to help those organisations migrate to perhaps towards a standard form of data. And I think that's where organisations such as ourselves can play. In collaboration with banks or other organisations, you mentioned SWIFT, for example, who have a history in applying standards, then I think that sort of consortium approach, where we are perhaps an organisation running it, but with the support of the banks and SWIFT as a community, so that there's a genuine drive for it to be used by the community, I think is how we see that utility going forward. And I agree with you. I think there's probably a role for one utility. You might look at utilities for different roles, maybe utility for securities processing, a utility for legal entity and so on. But I don't think anyone wants an industry where there's perhaps 10, 12, 15 utilities, because that's no different than what we have today.
From the research I did, it seemed to me that this isn't the first time that people have talked about this, and I suspect that it's gained renewed impetus post the crisis. That suggests to me that there are obvious challenges in trying to get the industry to move to a new model. Right now, what do you think those are, and how do you think they can be, perhaps if not overcome, at least addressed head on?
Well, I think perception of what the utility is about, a clear definition as to what the utility is looking to provide, I think would help. I think we have got into this discussion of standards versus the utility rather than standards and a utility, which I think, again, extra clarification would help refine people's thoughts and arguments as to what the way forward is. I think there's a huge industry around data management. So there's always this fear factor in moving away from the unknown. We do what we do today, it sort of works, it's costly, it's slightly cumbersome, but we get by. I think there is a bit of a fear as to whether we should move away from that. I think the last 18 months people have certainly started speaking about disruptive solutions. There's been much more of an appetite for disruptive solutions in the marketplace, a fundamental way of changing the way in which we do things. And I think the utility has come back into preeminence because of that, because it would fundamentally change how we do things. In the past, I think people have looked at addressing individual organisation savings. So how can I lower your data management costs? Which is fine until, of course, you share your data with the counterparty and the trade breaks because they're using different data to you. You might have very, very clean data, but it all really relies on how consistent your data is with the counterparty. I think the central utility brings that consistency to the table, so all parties are using the same set of data, which then delivers ultimately what we're after in terms of higher transaction flows, lower breaks, and therefore lower cost.
I mean, you mentioned the word disruptive there, which sounds quite intimidating. Do you think that we would only really achieve that through a regulatory initiative as opposed to just a sort of collaborative industry initiative?
No, I think the industry can take the lead. I don't think it should necessarily or needs to rely on legislation to get to that. It's ultimately in the industry's benefit. It's not something that the industry, I think, feels forced or compelled to do. Often with regulation, people associate that with additional cost. I'm just doing it because I have to. In this instance, I think there's a genuine desire within the industry to lower transaction costs, to limit the amount of breaks. Something like 16% of trades break because of issues with reference data. 29% of trades break in derivatives processing because of reference data issues. So I think there's a genuine desire in the industry to get beyond where we are today, to improve the processing that we have. Therefore, I think the industry should actually take the lead and can take the lead on this rather than wait for legislation.